Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I'm Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. Hey, I acknowledge we're going to be a little late to this party, but for the last couple days, many of you have been completely freaking out about the notion that the Trump administration may try to merge the ATF with the DEA. And a lot of people are screaming this is a terrible idea, and a few of them are actually justifying that. We'll get to that in a moment. But, you know, I get this is a very complicated equation that many of you think can be simplified by one simple subtraction from the equation. Is that realistically possible? And is that actually a good idea? What we're going to try to do today is take what appears to be a very complicated equation. We're going to try to simplify it, but we're going to give you a slightly different formula than what many of you think. So today, let's spend a few minutes and let's talk about maybe they should do this instead of merging the DEA and ATF. Okay, America, you have spent the last couple of days really freaking out, even though the news broke that this was coming back in March, when there was rumor that the Trump administration was looking at merging the DEA and the ATF. Now we officially have it in writing, because for those of you who really want to geek out on stuff, every single budget has a supplement, and in that supplement is an appendix. And the 2026 budget has a 1,224-page appendix. And if you go looking at the bottom page 618, you will see, after a long lead-in about how the ATF and the DEA have so many crossover investigations and so many of the same things, you will see that the Trump administration states, to most successfully, effectively, and efficiently continue the fight to eradicate the designated cartel FTOs and seek to eliminate violent crime, the ATF will be incorporated into DEA, addressing both drug crimes and gun crimes. This transaction will be initiated in fiscal year 2026 and achieve efficiencies in resources and case deconfliction. Okay, now, many of you are screaming that this is an absolutely terrible idea, but many of you are not backing up why, other than you just think that, well, the conglomeration of two federal alphabet agencies is a bad idea. You're probably right, okay? So let's go through this proposed solution, because does it have problems? Yeah, I think it has significant problems. Problem number one is that, let's face it, the ATF is not that good at what they do. Number two, the DEA is not that good at what they do. Combine the two of them, how do either of them get better? They probably make each other worse. So I have a hard time seeing how you take two inefficient government agencies, combine them together, and suddenly have an efficient government agency. Number two, when you start combining some of their activities, we're getting well beyond the Second Amendment here, folks. We're getting into Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Eighth Amendment, and things like that. So to overcomplicate the equation and do it with now a less efficient government agency, probably bad public policy. So I think we can all agree that a proposed merger of the DEA and the ATF is a bad idea. Let's move to the next option, which of course is the one that most of you are rooting for, which is a complete abolition of the ATF. Well, for the sake of this hypothetical, let's assume that that just occurred and the ATF has been, in fact, abolished. Well, here's what hasn't been abolished, and it can't be done through executive action. This could only be done actually through legislation. But what hasn't been abolished, even though the ATF is now gone, is all federal gun laws, all the gun stores that still need to be regulated, all the applications for NFA items that still need to be processed, the classification of any new firearms by a manufacturer, the processing of all 4473s, and a litany of other regulatory tasks. And the bottom line is that all of that activity still needs to be regulated. Because if you want to sit there and say, well, listen, if we abolish the ATF, we also then abolish all federal gun laws. No, you don't. You just abolish the agency that was enforcing some of the federal gun laws. Now, recognize that federal gun laws can be enforced by any federal agency. It can be enforced by the FBI, U.S. Marshals. There are other law enforcement agencies, which brings me perhaps to a more simplified solution, which is rather than abolishing the ATF, we just call it little a, little t, little f. And we take all of this regulatory stuff that we talked about already, and that becomes the core function of the ATF. You see, that actually becomes what they do. And so therefore, Who is actually regulating the FFL industry? Who actually is processing the applications on the Form 1s and the Form 4s and the 4473s? And who's approving the gun trust? And who's approving transfers in and out of gun trust? And who's regulating the NFA items? And who's working with manufacturers to make sure that the items that they are manufacturing are in compliance with federal law? That is one of the purposes of the ATF, and despite the fact that there is a tremendous amount of vocal criticism about them, those functions are typically not the target of that criticism. So you put those functions over here under little a, little t, little f. So now what's left for the ATF? Well, it's the policy-making portion of it, but of course that is always dictated by who? The Attorney General, who is always dictated by what? That's right, the President of the United States. And that is the political part of the equation that is virtually impossible to escape. But then we get to the last component of the ATF's job, the law enforcement aspect, where they, for some reason, even though they started as a tax collection agency, are now acting as a full law enforcement agency. And what has that led to? Well, it's led to things like Waco and Ruby Ridge and Brian Malinowski. And it is, in fact, the one component that is by far the centerpiece of almost all criticism against the ATF. But here's the thing. The ATF is not necessary to enforce gun laws. The ATF is not necessary to go out and execute search warrants and arrest warrants. There are other federal law enforcement agencies to do that. And by the way, and here's a good example. If you are a person who just goes out and inspects electric meters as part of the job for a local municipality, and while taking a look at a home's meter, which is completely out of whack, you realize that they have an illegal marijuana grow operation, you know that that person who works for the electrical company can merely call law enforcement, and then law enforcement could actually come in and investigate and or arrest. It's no different with the ATF. Throughout all of their regulatory work, they're going to find abnormalities. They're going to find inconsistencies. They will find evidence, perhaps, of criminal activity. And it does not mean that they can't then bring in other law enforcement agencies, such as the FBI, to conduct an investigation. And then if arrests and warrants need to be issued, it can be done by the FBI, U.S. Marshals, or other pre-existing federal law enforcement agencies. And so what this does, pardon the pun, is it puts a big, gigantic safety now on the ATF, because they don't get to go out and play cops and robbers anymore. And they don't get to go out and play with their new toys and kick doors in and do all of those things. We'll actually let other law enforcement agencies handle that, and they will be tasked with, that's right, just merely regulating the firearms industry as they were designed to. Moreover, if you have an ATF that has been stripped down to mere regulatory actions and some policy interpretation, that is a far more useful tool that the Department of Justice can actually use, as we're seeing today in the advancements and the fortification of your Second Amendment rights. So listen, the reality of the situation is that this proposed merger is a bad idea. And yeah, the abolition, I get that, and I certainly get the passion for that. But that's going to require an act of legislation, and that, well, that's just not going to happen. But even if that happens, that's really only going to solve half of the problem for most of you, because the other problem still remains, which is that there are federal gun laws, and somebody's going to enforce them. And that is why I believe little ATF is perhaps a more reasonable and simple solution to a complicated equation. All right, listen, interested to hear what you may all have to say. That's cool. I'm a big boy. I can take it. If you got any questions about this or anything else related to what's left of our Second Amendment rights, you guys should know how to get a hold of Washington gun law by now. But if you don't, that's okay. That information's down there in the description box. If you got an idea for a video we should be doing around here, cool. Click on that link right there and tell us all about it. If you want to subscribe to the monthly newsletter, that information's down there in the description box. And then finally, and most importantly, let's everyone remember that part of being a lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here, is to know what the law is in every situation and how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching and stay safe.